Hello everyone, good evening, and today, since it is Friday, I'm going to be doing my Disney versus original work, and today I'm going to be discussing The Fox and the Hound. Now, The Fox and the Hound actually came before The Black Cauldron. I apologize that I got these two mixed up. The Fox and the Hound did come first, so we're kind of going back in Disney history here before The Black Cauldron, which was considered a very, very low, probably the lowest point in Disney history. And we're just going back briefly to the film that came out previously. Now, just to kind of recap where exactly we were at, before Fox and the Hound, there was, I believe it was Robin Hood, as well as with the Aristocats, which weren't based upon anything. So really we are leaving off from the only one that is based upon a original source material, but it was before The Black Cauldron. So I'll be going back to this one, and then we'll be discussing The Little Mermaid, which did not come after The Black Cauldron. First it was The Great Mouse Detective, and The Great Mouse Detective is not necessarily based on anything, but it is sort of inspired by the Sherlock Holmes stories, and you can sort of tell once you decide to watch the movie how these elements of Sherlock Holmes are within The Great Mouse Detective. And then there's Oliver and Company, and even though Oliver and Company is sort of based upon Oliver Twist in a way, you could say, it's more inspired sort of in a similar way, I think, with The Great Mouse Detective, and that it's not really going with the source material so much as it is just using the kinds of things within the source material to sort of draw inspiration and create a totally different story. And although The Fox and the Hound, the original work, as well as the Disney work, is rather different in how everything is kind of laid out, but the premises of what each story is trying to say are sort of present. So I figured this would definitely be a good version to start off with for this particular month when I'll be doing videos. So basically, The Fox and the Hound story is rather different from the Disney work in the sense of how dark it is. The Disney version, although it has these very cutesy light moments, there is still some dark undertones to it, but this novel is dark throughout the entire thing, and pretty much is kind of a sort of a way of showing the grittiness of hunting and revenge and such, whereas the Disney version it's a story more about friendship, and how friendships change over time, and how people move on from those friendships and relationships and develop new ones as well. So Disney plays itself out more as a friendship story, but in the original work it's more about revenge, it's more about the harsh reality of this life of hunting in the woods. And you might be wondering how I came to this conclusion, and the only way I can best explain this is through going with you through the plot. So basically, the novel starts out way different than the Disney version. The novel basically starts off with the same characters pretty much. You've got Chief, who's another hound, who's really the main character. But unlike in the Disney version, Chief, who is another dog, along with Copper, another hunting dog, within this story, he's actually younger. In the Disney version, he's older, a lot older than Copper. So we see that you kind of see it a little bit too in the Disney version, this sort of rivalry between the two, except it's more Chief being jealous of Copper because Copper is younger in this case. But in the original work, Chief is a lot younger, and he's therefore a lot stronger than Copper, and especially when it comes to hunting, and that's what makes Copper end up being jealous. And unlike in the Disney work where we see that the bear comes in the climax, we kind of see this towards the beginning in the original work, where the bear attacks the hunter and the two dogs, Chief and Copper, when they're basically hunting one day. And then what ends up happening is that Chief ultimately stands up and protects the master, and the master is basically the hunter human, and Copper is too scared of the bear and decides not to ultimately pursue the bear. So this makes the master more drawn to, again, Chief, and you kind of see this big jealousy within Copper after that particular event happens within the novel. So that's basically how it starts off in the original work. We just start off with Copper. In the Disney work, it actually starts off with Todd, and it shows Todd's mother trying to protect him from a hunter, but she ultimately ends up being killed, which is the same thing in the original work. But Copper in the Disney work is raised by a young woman or older woman, but in the original work he is raised by another hunter. So that's really basically the gist difference. So you don't have that bonding relationship between the old woman and Todd so much, because you just have a human hunter as the person that ultimately raises Copper. And then sort of Copper, you'll see in the Disney work how Copper ultimately returns to the wild, and Todd, ultimately returns to the wild. And I want to say that I'm talking about Todd. I think I'm getting Todd and Copper mixed up. Todd is the fox, Copper is the hound. So Todd's the one whose mom gets killed and gets raised by this human hunter in the original work. And basically when he reaches maturity, he goes into the wild again. As opposed to the Disney work where the reasoning behind him going into the wild is because the old lady realizes that the hunter, who's again the same kind of character as in the Disney work, is ultimately going to hurt Copper, and she feels like that it's best that Copper stays safe in the wild, away from the hunter, in sort of a very isolated location, so that Copper can ultimately survive. That's the whole reasoning behind the Disney work. But in the original work, he just reaches that age where he can live on his own, and so he goes and he lives on his own. And then once he starts going upon his home, that's when he comes into contact with the master's house in the original work. But in the Disney work, you'll see how right away Copper realizes that there's a house with a hunter, and he meets Copper, and they develop in the Disney work a very strong friendship. In the original work, none of that happens at all. Copper and Todd are pretty much separate throughout the entire original work. But basically, what happens in the original work is that Todd goes to this house, and then he sort of taunts the dogs, and then as he's doing this multiple times, it comes to a point where Chief, the younger dog in this case in the original work, breaks loose, and then the Copper, the other dog, as well as the master, the hunter, follow Chief. And then basically you kind of get a similar situation as you saw in the Disney work, except in the Disney work, Chief is ultimately injured by falling off the train tracks, because you'll see how Chief and Copper trying to get Todd, and Todd ends up going on the racetracks, and then he just jumps off and manages to escape. But then Chief ultimately ends up falling from the train tracks, and then hitting himself hard and injuring himself in the Disney work. In the original work, he dies. He gets hit by the train and he dies. That's how the original work plays itself out, for the most part. And this obviously causes a huge impact upon Todd and the Master and the Hunter. Master/Hunter. They are really mad at Todd now. It's really, really go time. It's really revenge time. In the Disney work, it sort of plays out in that way too, except you sort of see Todd and Copper when they're young, when they get together, and then they split apart because Copper ultimately ends up learning to being a hunting dog, because again, he is younger, and then when he comes back, you'll see how their relationship ultimately splits apart, and this is what leads to that scene where we see with the train tracks. That's really how it breaks down for the most part. Unlike the original work where there is no relationship between Copper and Todd, pretty much. So, even though Chief ends up being injured, they sort of are after sort of the similar thing of revenge. But I think the original work has more power to it because Chief actually dies, and I think even the Nostalgia Critic, if you watch the Nostalgia Critic's Disney December, he was talking about this and saying, why didn't they let Chief die? Because it would have made it more impacting. And I kind of agree, yeah, that would have made it probably more impacting, but it might have been a little bit too dark. I'm not sure why Disney chose not to have Chief killed off, because again, they've killed off tons of characters in Disney. So I don't know why this one would have been so bad to kill, but I guess they just decided not to go with that, and Chief just ends up being injured. But they sort of have after that event, in both versions, there is this sense of, from the Master, Chief, and Copper in the Disney version to want revenge, and for Master and Copper in the original work to want revenge for what Todd did. And so basically they create all of these elaborate hunting traps in the original work in order to get Todd. And in the meantime, Todd ends up finding another fox. And I think they actually give this fox a name in the Disney work. I think her name is, it's either Vixie or Trixie, I'm not sure. But they just end up getting together in the Disney work, but they don't have kids. In the original work, they do get together and they do have kids. And basically what ends up happening one day to the kids is that they end up being caught in this den at one point, and basically the Master finds all of the foxes, baby foxes, and basically he gasses the entire den, killing all of the babies, baby foxes, which is really sad. It was really dark. When I read that part, I go, wow, this is really dark. But basically, after the Master kills the kids, he ends up finding the Todd's lover, or wife, I guess in this case, lover, however you want to put a fox and a female and a male fox being together in any way, shape, or form. But basically, what ends up happening is that he ends up finding her ultimately and kills her. And then after that, Todd ends up finding another fox in the original work, and then they mate and they have kids. But then the Master ends up killing the kids again, and instead he uses like a rabbit call, and then to lure the small foxes, and then ultimately that's what ends up killing the kids. And then he uses one of the wounded kids to entice the mom, Todd's mate, to come, and basically she falls for the trap, and then he kills her too. So yes, this is rather dark. No killing of mates in the Disney version, and there's no second mate. There's only just the one mate that Todd has throughout the story. And they are pursued though at one point by the Master and by Copper. But ultimately there is no killing and there are no kids in the Disney work. Now, what ends up happening in the original work is that the forest starts getting infected with rabies, and ultimately the humans are really concerned about this, and for the most part it's the foxes that are getting these rabies. And basically these hunters start to go and kill massive amounts of foxes because they don't want this disease to ultimately spread. And then Master lets Copper out one day at one point, and then Copper ends up running into Todd. He ends up catching his scent and runs after him, and then ultimately, as they're chasing each other, Todd ends up giving up and dying of exhaustion. And then basically what happens after that is Copper ends up collapsing up on top of him. But then the Master finds Copper, and then raises him back to health. But the thing is that throughout the entire original, or for the most part through the original work, the Master is kind of an alcoholic, and the people within the surrounding area feel like he should go to a nursing home and a place where dogs aren't really allowed there. And then ultimately he realizes he has a problem and that he needs to probably go to the nursing home. And so in the end, it doesn't come out and clearly say that Copper was shot by his master, but it's sort of implied, because it says at the end that he takes out the shotgun, the Master, and then he kind of tells Copper to sit down, and then Copper licks him, but that's the end. They don't openly say that he actually kills Copper, but I think that's really what's implied. What ends up really actually happening is that they ultimately their friendship is shot because of the fact that he can't control his drinking and he can't raise a dog. So that's really the end of the original work. In the Disney work, though, it's a little bit different because Copper ultimately, as well as Todd, end up being okay. And then this is where we get to the point where they have the bear as part of the climax, and basically Todd and Copper get sort of caught up with this bear, and the bear sort of ends up attacking all three of them, the Master, Copper, and Todd. And ultimately, the Master wants to shoot Todd, but then because of that friendship that they developed in the Disney version, Copper can't find it in himself to have the Master kill Todd, so he goes up and he blocks the Master, and he sort of looks at him and says, you know, if you kill him, you'll have to get through me first. And then the Master sort of puts down his weapon and gives up, and then ultimately Copper and Todd go about and live their separate lives, and Todd lives with his lover, and then Copper lives with Chief and the Master, and it's sort of like this bittersweet ending because ultimately they're separated, but there's still like a common understanding between the two, and they sort of have this reminiscence in the end of sort of the past, at least Copper does at the end of the story, and that's really pretty much how the Disney version ends for the most part. And sort of the old lady as well as the hunter sort of make up, and even though they've had their differences because of Copper and because of the fact that the hunter wanted to really hunt Copper and the old lady wanted to really raise and take care of Copper, or take care of Todd. I'm getting these two names mixed up. Todd is the fox. She takes care of the fox. Copper is the hound. I'm getting these two names mixed up. but really ultimately that's what happens in the end for the most part in the Disney version. Todd's owner makes up with the hunter. Todd lives out his separate life in the wild. Copper lives out his separate life as a hunting dog with the other dog, Chief, and that's really the end of the Disney work. So really that's really how this all plays out. I think for the most part the characters are fairly structured in the same way. I think the hunter is a little bit more of a misunderstood character in the Disney version rather than in the original work, which plays him out as a lot more cruel, and especially when the fact that he was willing to shoot one of his own dogs, that kind of says something, I think. And again, there's this whole other character of the old lady in the Disney work that's not in the original work at all. I think Copper and Todd in particular are a little bit more wild than in the Disney work, that plays them out as a little bit more innocent and just caught up within the circumstances that they're in. But in the original work, it sort of seems like that these circumstances are what make up their life, and ultimately what make them who they are. And the sense of not having that kind of friendship, unlike in the Disney work, I think makes their characters a little bit more gritty and a little bit more adult, I guess you could say, rather than have that childish innocence within them like it's displayed in the Disney work. But I really think that's all I can say for the most part. I really think that's ultimately how it breaks down. There's also some side characters in the Disney work that aren't in the original work, like the mama owl and these two other birds. I think these two other birds that aren't in the original work at all. And for the most part, it focuses more on just the grittiness and the harsh reality of this kind of life as a hunter. Whereas in the Disney work, it's more about the friendship that Todd and Copper develop throughout the story. But I really think that's all I can say about this one. It's pretty straightforward. I apologize if I got the names mixed up. Again, Todd is the fox, Copper is the hound. But if there's any more confusions, I'd be more than happy to answer any of your questions, comments, or concerns. So yes, the next work will be starting the Disney Renaissance, technically speaking, because it'll be The Little Mermaid, followed by, I believe, followed by The Little Mermaid, we'll be doing Beauty and the Beast, and skipping The Rescuers Down Under, because The Rescuers Down Under is unfortunately not based upon an original work. And then so after Beauty and the Beast will be Aladdin, which is actually based upon something, and I'm going to look into, which sounds fairly interesting. But I'll make sure to put links below to the research that I found regarding the original work. I'll see if I can try to find the movie for the Disney movie and also put links into it. But yeah, I think that's really all I can say. Again, any questions, comments, concerns, more than happy to answer them. And until next time, everybody.